Somewhere in the ancient world, before the pyramids, before the alphabet, before anyone thought to write down the names of kings, there was already a story about a time even older than that. A time so distant that the people telling it could only gesture toward it with enormous numbers and the names of cities that the river had long since swallowed. They called it the time before the flood, and they wrote it down. That's the part that gets you. Not that the flood story exists, because flood stories exist almost everywhere on Earth, in almost every culture that ever built a boat or watched a river rise. What gets you is that the Sumerians didn't just tell the story of the flood, they preserved, in careful cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, a list of everything that supposedly came before it. Kings and cities and reigns stretching back tens of thousands of years. A framework for prehistory, a map of a world that may or may not have ever existed exactly as they described it. So here's the question this episode is going to sit with very slowly, without rushing to any conclusions. What if those Sumerian records, imperfect and mythologized as they are, preserve some real framework, some echo, some structural memory of a world that existed before catastrophic flooding reshaped the landscape of the ancient Near East? Not a literal account, not proof of anything supernatural, just the possibility that inside these ancient texts there are real geographical names, real city locations, real patterns that correspond to something that actually happened. That's a careful question, and careful is the right pace for tonight. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what it's designed for. So find a comfortable position, maybe let your eyes close and just follow the words. If you want to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there, leave a comment. I check them, and it's one of the strangest and best parts of making these. Someone in Nairobi at midnight, someone in Vancouver at noon, someone on a train in Japan, all listening to the same ancient question at completely different hours. It's a small thing, but it makes the world feel genuinely remarkable. Now, the Sumerians. Most people have a vague sense that they were ancient, that they invented writing, that they lived somewhere in the Middle East a very long time ago. All of that is true, but the scale of how old we're talking tends to slide past without landing properly. The oldest Sumerian writing we've found dates to around 3,400 BCE. That's already 5,400 years ago, which is older than the Roman Empire by roughly the same margin that the Roman Empire is older than us. And the Sumerians themselves looked back at a past they considered even more ancient. They had records, or what they treated as records, of a time before everything changed. Before the flood came down and swept the world clean. Before kingship, as they put it, had to descend from heaven a second time. That phrase alone, a second time, implies a first time. It implies a before. This episode is going to move through those texts carefully, the way you'd move through a room where the floor might not entirely hold. We'll start with the sources themselves, who wrote them, when, what they were actually trying to accomplish, because these are not neutral historical documents, and treating them as though they are leads you somewhere misleading very quickly. Then we'll move into the specific content of what the Sumerians described as the antediluvian world, the cities, the kings, the cosmology, the math behind those enormous reigns that stretch into the tens of thousands of years. Then we'll look at the flood narratives themselves, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the flood tablet from Gilgamesh, all three of which are telling versions of what is probably the same ancient story, but telling it with different emphasis, different details, different theological purposes. And after all of that, we'll turn to what archaeology and geology actually say. What evidence exists, if any, for large-scale flooding events in the ancient Near East? What the landscape around Mesopotamia looked like 6,000 or 7,000 years ago? What we can responsibly say and what we genuinely cannot. That last part matters more than people sometimes expect. There's a real temptation when dealing with material this old and this layered to collapse the uncertainty. To decide either that these texts are pure mythology with nothing historical inside them, or to go the other direction and treat them as encoded eyewitness testimony. Both of those moves cut the story short too early. The more interesting place to stand is in the middle, where the uncertainty is honest and the texts are allowed to be complicated things, which is what they actually are. Mythologized memory, priestly framework, political document, cosmological poetry, all of those at once. So tonight's pace is going to be slow. There are no dramatic reveals here, no sudden shocking conclusions. What there is instead is a long, careful look at some of the oldest writing humanity produced, read with genuine curiosity and appropriate humility. The kind of thinking you can follow with your eyes closed and your breathing slow. The ancient world is not going anywhere. It has been waiting under the clay for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer while we approach it gently. The story begins not with the flood itself, but with the world the Sumerians believed existed before it. A world of cities along rivers that no longer run where they once did. A world where, according to the texts, kings ruled for lengths of time that seem impossible by any biological measure. A world that ended, or was transformed, or was remembered as ending when the waters came. Let's go there slowly. Let's start with who left us these records, and what kind of world they lived in when they wrote them down. The people who wrote these things down were not, for the most part, historians in any sense we would recognize. They were scribes, trained from childhood in schools called a duba, which translates roughly as tablet house, where young men, almost always men, spent years learning to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay using a cut reed. The curriculum was demanding in a way that sounds almost monastic. Students copied texts over and over, not to understand them initially, but to internalize the shapes, the sequences, the feel of the signs under the stylus. Thousands of signs, hundreds of texts. Some of the surviving school tablets still show the teacher's version on one side and the student's imperfect copy on the other, the ancient equivalent of homework, preserved by accident in the same clay that preserved everything else. Clay is the reason we have any of this at all. It's an accident of chemistry. Papyrus rots, wood burns, cloth disintegrates, but clay, once fired, whether deliberately or by the accident of a building burning down around it, becomes essentially permanent. The tablets that survived the ancient world's fires survived because of them. Conquerors who burned Mesopotamian cities were unknowingly doing archaeology a favour, baking records into permanence that might otherwise have crumbled back into mud. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which is where some of the most significant flood texts come from, was destroyed by fire around 612 BCE. The tablets inside were fired hard as brick. Most of what we know about Mesopotamian literature we owe to that destruction. So the physical survival of these texts is already shaped by accident, by violence, by the specific chemistry of one particular writing material. That's worth holding in mind as we go forward. What we have is not a complete archive. It's a sample, filtered by which cities were burned, which tablets happened to be buried in the right kind of soil, which excavations found them, and which found them before they crumbled to powder in the open air. The texts themselves come in several different genres, and the genres matter because they have different purposes and different relationships to whatever we might call factual content. King lists are administrative documents at heart, records of political succession, claims to legitimacy. Epics are literary compositions, long narrative poems meant to be performed or recited, shaped by aesthetic choices and theological arguments as much as by anything resembling reportage. Myths explain origins, the beginning of cities, the nature of the gods, the reason death exists, the reason floods happen. Hymns praise deities or kings, sometimes both at once since the boundary between the two was often deliberately blurred. Each of these genres tells you something, but what it tells you and the manner in which it tells you depends heavily on what the text was trying to accomplish in the first place. A king list that includes antediluvian reigns of 30,000 years is not making the same kind of claim a modern census makes. Understanding that doesn't make the text less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because now you're reading it on its own terms, rather than grading it by standards it was never trying to meet. There's also the question of language, which is more complicated than it might first appear. Sumerian and Akkadian are two entirely different languages, unrelated to each other in structure and origin. Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no family tree connecting it to anything else spoken before or since. Akkadian is a Semitic language, related to Babylonian, Assyrian, and distantly to Hebrew and Arabic. For much of Mesopotamian history, these two languages coexisted, with Sumerian functioning increasingly as a prestige language of religion and scholarship, even after it had died out as a spoken tongue, roughly the way Latin continued to be used in European scholarship long after no one grew up speaking it at home. Many of the flood texts exist in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, or in later Babylonian copies of older originals, or in versions that appear to be translations of sources that no longer survive. The Eridu Genesis is primarily Sumerian. The Atrahasis epic is Akkadian. The flood tablet in the Gilgamesh cycle is Akkadian, but draws on material that may have Sumerian antecedents. What this means practically is that when scholars work with these texts, they're often dealing with layers, an Akkadian version of a Sumerian story, copied by a Babylonian scribe in the 7th century BCE, from a tablet that was already itself a copy of something older, possibly from the 3rd millennium. Each layer of transmission introduces the possibility of change, editorial revision, theological updating, filling in gaps where the original was damaged or ambiguous. The later copies sometimes matter enormously, because they preserve versions of texts whose earlier forms are too fragmentary to read. But they also come with the caveat that we can't always know what changed in the transmission, and what stayed the same. And then there's the damage. Most of these tablets are broken. The Sumerian flood story, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, survives in a single badly damaged tablet where crucial sections are simply missing, turned to gap and blank. Scholars indicate these absences with brackets and ellipses, and reading an academic translation is partly an exercise in learning to notice the silences, the places where the text says something like, "The gods then decided," and then several lines are gone, and the next readable line picks up in the middle of an action already underway. These aren't small gaps. Some run to dozens of lines. Reconstructing what might have been there requires comparison with parallel texts, knowledge of formulaic phrasing that appears in similar passages elsewhere, and a certain amount of informed judgment that is honest about its own uncertainty even when it's making a best guess. All of this is the methodological ground we're standing on tonight. Not quicksand, but not bedrock either. It's something in between, a surface that holds if you step carefully, if you pay attention to where the solid patches are and where the ground becomes speculative. Here is the approach that seems most productive for what we're going to do over the course of this episode. Think of the flood as a narrative boundary, a line that the texts themselves draw. On one side of that line is the antediluvian world, the time before. On the other side is history as the Sumerians understood it, the world as it was reconstituted after the waters receded, with kingship descending from heaven again, and the cities of historical Mesopotamia rising along the rivers. That boundary is where the interesting questions live, not whether the flood happened exactly as described, which is probably not the right question, but what the texts preserve on either side of it, what geographical details survive, what names, what patterns, and whether any of those details correspond to things we can locate or corroborate through other means. The people who assembled these records were working from something. Maybe oral tradition, maybe fragments of older writing, maybe priestly memory, the kind that accumulates in temples over centuries and takes on the shape of the institution that holds it. They were not making things up from nothing, because no one does. They were working with inherited material, shaping it toward purposes that made sense in their time, pressing meaning into clay the way their students pressed signs, with care and intention, and a certain relationship to an original that we can sense but often can't fully see. That's where we are, standing at the edge of the cuneiform archive, looking at tablets that are broken and ancient and indispensable. We know who made them, roughly. We know why, roughly. We know the languages they used and the genres they worked in, and the limits of what even the best translation can deliver. We know that what we're reading is not transparent history, but something more interesting and more difficult than that. And with all of that in mind, let's move forward, into the content itself, into the world the Sumerians described as existing before everything changed. It begins with a phrase that is both simple and quietly staggering: kingship descended from heaven. Kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian king list opens its story of the world with that line, and the texts repeat it like a refrain. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. When one city loses power and another rises, kingship doesn't just move, it is taken from one place and given to another. Kingship itself is treated as a thing, not a job description, not an election result, a sacred object moving through time. When you hear that phrase in English, it's easy to imagine something literal and cinematic, a throne dropping out of the clouds. That's not quite what's going on. What you're looking at is political theology compressed into a single line. A way of saying that rule on earth was not simply human improvisation. It was anchored in a cosmic order that existed before any particular king, before any particular city, before the flood, and even before memory. In the Sumerian worldview, heaven and earth were not separate in the modern sense. They were layers of a single system. The gods inhabited the upper tiers, the humans occupied the ground floor, the underworld existed below, and between them all ran channels of influence, ritual, and obligation. When the text says kingship descended from heaven, it's declaring that legitimate rule is part of that system. The origin of authority is not the battlefield or the marketplace, but the divine assembly. That assembly matters because in Mesopotamian myth, the gods govern by council. The texts speak repeatedly of meetings of the great gods, sometimes the 7 who decree destinies, sometimes a larger, less defined group. Anu in the highest heaven, Enlil as lord of wind and decrees, Enki in the sweet underground waters, and others, younger and older, sitting together to decide how the world should run. They allocate territories, assign responsibilities, apportion honours. They decide to create humans. They decide to send a flood. They decide, in language that sounds almost bureaucratic, who will hold what office in the cosmos. Kingship descended from heaven means that the office of king belongs originally to that sphere, to those meetings. It is an aspect of divine order that humans receive, not something they invent. On the ground, that idea takes concrete form in cities, temples, and rulers. In Sumerian thought, cities are not just clusters of houses. They are the earthly domains of particular gods. Eridu belongs to Enki. Nippur is Enlil's city. Uruk is Inanna's. Each city has a central temple that functions as the god's house, but also as a kind of cosmic plug, a connection point between heaven's decisions and earth's reality. Rituals performed there, offerings given there, are not mere superstition in this framework. They are maintenance of the link that keeps order flowing down and blessings flowing out. The human king stands at that junction. He is not generally a god in full, at least not in the earliest Sumerian material. More often he's described as the shepherd of the people, chosen by the god of his city, sometimes even fashioned by that god in the womb, blessed with strength or wisdom or justice. He participates in rites that symbolically marry him to the land and to the deity. He oversees the temple's wealth, organizes the city's labor, leads armies when needed, and presides over festivals where myths are recited and reenacted. In that role, the king is an earthly anchor of cosmic order. His job is to make tangible, in brick and barley and law, the arrangements the gods have decreed in their councils. When a king is just, harvests are good, walls stand, enemies fail. When a king neglects the temples or rules cruelly, the texts often present this as a disturbance in the cosmic balance. The god withdraws favour, chaos rises, the city falls. Again, we're not reading journalism here, we're reading ideology. Stories about how power should work told from within temple-centered courts that had every reason to present their arrangements as natural, inevitable, and divinely desired. Kingship descended from heaven is a claim about legitimacy. It says, this is not arbitrary. This is how the universe itself is set up. At the same time, the phrase quietly does something else. It turns kingship into a transferable, almost detachable quality. In the king list, kingship appears in Eridu first. Then, when Eridu fell, kingship moves to Bad Tibira, later to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak. After the flood, it re-emerges in Kish, then shifts from city to city in a long sequence. This is not describing literal glowing crowns floating from gate to gate. It is encoding the rise and fall of political centres as part of the same divine narrative. When a city gains supremacy, the text can say, in effect, the gods moved kingship here. When it loses supremacy, the gods took kingship away. This is why the idea of a divine council is so central. In myths like Atrahasis and the Eridu Genesis, the gods meet to decide whether humans will exist, how many of them there will be, how long they will live, whether they will be allowed to continue after they've angered their creators. In later Assyrian and Babylonian literature, councils debate war, kingship, and fate. Human politics is being framed, again and again, as downstream from those debates. So when the king list tells you that, in the time before the flood, kingship descended from heaven, it isn't just giving you a poetic origin story. It's setting up the entire antediluvian period as a kind of golden template, a first run of world order in which cities, temples, and rulers functioned in direct alignment with the will of the gods. The numbers that follow, the reigns of tens of thousands of years, belong to that logic. They are not, under this reading, attempts to measure time with a stopwatch. They are signals of a qualitatively different era, when proximity between heaven and earth was closer, when kingship as a divine institution operated at full strength. It's worth pausing here to keep our interpretive footing. We can read kingship descended from heaven as a literal report if we want to. Ancient audiences might have done so at least some of the time, imagining a more direct visible involvement of gods in human affairs in the deep past. But we can also, and probably more usefully, read it as metaphor and ideology, a way of saying power is sacred, the city is sacred, the temple is the hinge of the world. To obey the king is, under proper conditions, to participate in cosmic order. Modern scholarship tends to hover between these understandings, acknowledging that for the people who copied these texts, the distinction between literal and symbolic was not drawn in the same sharp way it often is today. What matters for our purposes is simply that this line, this idea of a heaven-sent kingship, is the structural beam the rest of the story rests on. Because once kingship is a gift from heaven, the long antediluvian reigns, the chosen cities, and even the flood itself can be framed as episodes in a single overarching narrative: how divine order arrives on earth, how it is maintained, how it fails, and how it returns. With that framework in place, we can look more closely at the document that uses it most systematically. The Sumerian king list is not just a list of names. It is a memory map stretched across this theology of kingship, tracing the path of heaven's gift from the first cities before the flood to the dynasties that thought of themselves as historical. The text we now call the Sumerian king list survives in many versions. Clay tablets copied and recopied over centuries, with small differences in names and numbers, some broken, some neatly preserved. Most of them come from the early 2nd millennium BCE, long after the earlier Sumerian cities had risen, competed, and in many cases already faded. The scribes who wrote these versions were looking backward. They were arranging the past. On the surface, the king list is simple. It is a sequence. In such and such a city, so-and-so was king. He ruled X years. When that city fell, kingship moved on. Another city, another sequence of rulers, another block of years. At the end of each block, a transition. At one point, the transition is unlike the others. There, between two sets of dynasties, the text drops a single stark line. Then the flood swept over. That structurally is what the king list is doing. It is organizing time into stretches of ordered rule. From the point of view of the scribes, history is not a chaotic tangle of overlapping authorities and local traditions. It's a single line of kingship passed like a relay baton from one urban centre to another. In reality, of course, cities overlapped, rival dynasties warred, petty kings claimed titles in the shadow of greater powers. The king list flattens this. Its purpose is not to report every detail. Its purpose is to say, through all of that noise there is one legitimate thread, one kingship, the one that descended from heaven. When we read the king list today, we can divide it into two great zones: before the flood, after the flood. The antediluvian section is short in terms of names, but immense in terms of time. 8 kings ruling over 5 cities. Their reigns stretch across thousands and tens of thousands of years. 28,800 for one, 36,000 for another, 18,600 for a third. The text adds them up calmly, as if totaling a set of business accounts. Together, the pre-flood kings are said to have ruled for 241,200 years. Then comes the line about the flood, and after that the tone shifts. Reign length collapse from tens of thousands of years to mere hundreds. Names become more numerous. Cities we can excavate appear: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash. In this post-flood zone, some of the kings named on the tablets can be matched, at least plausibly, with rulers we know from contemporary inscriptions and monuments. This is where the king list becomes disorienting. On one page, it moves in a mythic register, talking about rulers whose lifespans are longer than entire civilizations. On the next, it seems to brush up against things we can touch: bricks stamped with royal names, dedicatory plaques, year names recording real events. Many scholars think that from a certain point onward, roughly in the middle of the after the flood section, the king list begins to reflect the memory of actual dynasties, though compressed and smoothed. So we are dealing with a hybrid document, part mythic prehistory, part political memory, held together by a theological line about kingship and a single watery catastrophe placed exactly in the middle. The numbers in the antediluvian section are often what catch the imagination. Did the Sumerians really believe a king could live for 28,800 years? Some later readers thought so. Others, ancient and modern, have suspected something more symbolic. The reign lengths are not random. They cluster around large orderly figures built out of base 60, the sexagesimal system the Mesopotamians loved. 60 times 60 times 10 times others factors. Several reigns can be expressed as neat combinations of sars and nirs, units of 3,600 and 600 years. To a numerate scribe trained in temple schools, these were not just big numbers, they were special numbers. They echoed measuring systems used for time, space, and ritual. In that light, the long reigns start to look less like failed attempts at chronology and more like numerology. The enormous totals can signal a kind of fullness or perfection. 10 kings before the flood, in some traditions, echoes later Mesopotamian and even biblical patterns. The sheer scale of their reigns can say, without footnotes, this was a different age. Time itself moved differently. Lifespans were longer, contact with the divine more direct. The kings of that world were saturated with the heavenly kingship, in a way later rulers could never be. They also work as prestige. To claim that your city once hosted a king who ruled for 28,800 years is to lay hold of an unimaginably deep past. It is a way of saying, our roots reach down beyond memory, beyond ordinary history into the first arrangement of the world. And because kingship in the king list is singular and transferable, that prestige can cascade forward. If your current dynasty can trace even a rhetorical line back to those antediluvian bearers of kingship, your legitimacy glows a little brighter. The flood in this structure is not just a story about water, it is a hinge that closes that first, exaggerated era and opens a second, more familiar one. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, Kish became the seat of kingship. That is the pattern. A break, then a restart. The flood wipes away the impossibly long reigns, the primordial cities, the earlier arrangement of kingship. What follows is a fresh issuing of the office, now operating within more human scales of time, tied to cities whose remains we can dig up. This hinge function matters for how historians use the king list. Very few specialists today would treat the antediluvian portion as a record of literal reign lengths. Some doubt that the individual rulers listed there were ever thought of, even by the scribes, as comparable to human kings in their own day. More often, that first section is read as a structured mythic prelude, carefully ordered, theologically loaded, but not a timeline in our sense. After the flood, the situation is different but still tricky. The king list is limited. It focuses on one line of kingship at a time and often ignores rival powers. It occasionally telescopes multiple overlapping dynasties into a neat series. It assigns single cities kingship that, in historical reality, may have been contested. And yet, when used cautiously, it can be helpful. It preserves the idea that certain cities at certain times were regarded as preeminent. Kish early on, then Uruk, then Ur, then others. As an index of prestige, that sequence tells us something about how Mesopotamian elites imagined their own political landscape. The list also embeds hints about ideology, which dynasties wanted to be seen as inheritors of the heaven-sent office, how they framed their relationship to the deep past, where they chose to insert or emphasize particular ruling houses. Even its silences are informative. Cities not granted kingship in the list were not necessarily powerless, but they were, in this textual tradition, marginal to the main story of legitimate rule. That tells us something about which centers managed to impose their narrative of history onto the scribal curriculum. So when we call the Sumerian king list a memory map, we are not saying it is a GPS track of events. We are saying it is a designed landscape of recollection. Mythic heights in the distance shrouded in the long light of pre-flood time, a deep valley of catastrophe carved between eras, and then, along the riverbanks of the Second World, a string of cities, each lit up in turn as the rightful bearer of heaven's kingship. Reading it slowly, especially in the stillness of night, you can almost feel that designed past settle around you. Not as a set of facts to memorize, but as a pattern the ancient scribes used to make sense of floods, ruins, and the rise and fall of their own fragile kings. Before the flood in the king list, there are not many names, but there are places. The text doesn't just say there were kings, it says kingship was housed. It moved through specific urban centres, each one, for a time, the seat of the heaven-given office. The sequence of those pre-flood cities is fairly stable across versions, even if details vary. First, Eridu, then Bad Tibera, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak, 5 cities, 8 kings, then the flood. If you look at a modern map, all 5 sit in what we would call southern Mesopotamia, in the alluvial plain built by the Tigris and Euphrates. But their imagined geography is a little more textured than a flat delta. Eridu, at the head of the list, was remembered as the southernmost, almost on the edge of the sea. In antiquity, that sea was the brackish marshland and tidal gulf that lapped at the edges of the Sumerian world. To later Mesopotamians, Eridu was not just a town, it was the first city, the place where culture itself began. Bad Tibera, the second city, lay further north. Its name is often glossed as Wall of the Copperworker or Fortress of the Metalworker, hinting at an association with craft and metallurgy. The site is probably to be sought somewhere between Eridu and Uruk, though its exact location is still debated. In the king list, it carries kingship for 3 reigns. Larak comes next. Unlike Eridu and Sippar, Larak has not been securely identified on the ground. Its name appears in a few other texts, tied to the god Pabalsag, but archaeologists have not yet pinned it to a mound with certainty. It probably lay in central Sumer, one more node in the network of early urban settlements. Sippar is easier to place. It sat in the north of the alluvial plain, near the later course of the Euphrates, roughly where modern Tel Abu Haba stands. In the Old Babylonian period, Sippar was a major cult centre of the sun god Shamash. In the king list, it is already there before the flood, taking its turn as the city that received kingship. Last, Shuruppak. This city, identified with modern Farah, lies on the Euphrates as well, south of Sippar, north of Uruk. Unlike some of the more shadowy antediluvian places, Shuruppak has yielded rich archaeological remains from the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Houses, streets, tablets. It was a real city with scribes, merchants, and household gods. In later flood stories it will acquire another role, the hometown of the man who survives. For the king list, though, the main point is the sequence. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled 36,000 years. 2 kings. They ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell and kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. The formula repeats. A city falls, and kingship is taken, or goes up to another. The verbs are important. Kingship is not born in each place. It is transferred. It arrives with authority, as if from outside. To say a city received kingship in this tradition is to say several things at once. It means that, for that stretch of imagined time, this city was the centre of a legitimate rule. Its king was not simply a strong man, he was the carrier of an office that, according to the prologue, had descended from heaven. His palace, his court, his rituals were the focal point of human order. It also implies that the city's temple cult was in alignment with that office. In Sumerian thought, kingship and divine patronage are intertwined. A city with kingship is not just politically important, it is religiously luminous. Its main god or goddess stands in a particular relation to the great assembly of deities. Its temple becomes, in effect, a cosmic headquarters, and it suggests that the city holds a certain kind of historical prestige. Later rulers who wrote building inscriptions at Ur or Isin could claim continuity with these pre-flood bearers of kingship, not because they literally inherited their palaces, but because they shared in the same abstract office. Kingship, like a sacred fire, had passed through a series of hearths, and their city's hearth had once hosted it too. Among the antediluvian cities, Eridu occupies a special place. Even outside the king list, Eridu appears again and again in Mesopotamian literature as an ancient, almost primordial landscape. It is the city of the god Enki, lord of sweet waters and wisdom. Later texts describe Eridu's temple, the Iabzu, as rising over the freshwater abyss that underlies the earth. When you read Sumerian hymns, Eridu is not just old, it is the oldest, the first place where kingship, offerings and scribal arts were set in order. Archaeology has only deepened that sense of antiquity. Excavations at the mound identified as ancient Eridu have revealed a long sequence of temple buildings, one piled above another, reaching back into the 6th millennium BCE. Small shrines grew into larger monumental structures. In each rebuilding, a sacred spot was respected and renewed. By the time the king list was composed, those strata of rebuilding were already themselves ancient. For the scribes, Eridu's depth was visible in the ground, layers of sanctuary reaching down toward the sweet waters below. That physical depth and literary aura may help explain why Eridu is first in the list. Giving it the opening position says, in effect, that kingship began not just anywhere, but in the city that embodied the oldest sacred landscape the scribes knew. If we step back from the theology for a moment, another pattern emerges. Lists of cities ordered by kingship, both before and after the flood, often roughly match what archaeologists call settlement hierarchies. In any given period, some cities are large, monumental, regionally dominant. Others are modest, more local in their influence. The king list, despite its flattening, tends to assign kingship to places that we know, from excavations and contemporaneous texts, or at some point major centres: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Akkad, Isin, Larsa. The antediluvian section may be doing something similar, but pushed back into the mythic before time. From a Middle Bronze Age scribe's perspective, naming Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shurupak as the earlier bearers of kingship is a way of inscribing the deep past of cities that, in their own day or in remembered history, had been important. The sequence is not a neutral census of all settlements that ever existed. It is a curated chain of prestige centres. This doesn't mean we can take the list at face value as a map of real political succession in the 4th millennium. The reigns are numerological, the flood line is theological. Some cities mentioned, like Larak, are still elusive in the ground. Others we know mainly from later levels, not from any securely pre-flood strata. The safest way to read the antediluvian cities is to keep 2 layers in view. On one layer, they belong to mythic prehistory. Their kings live impossibly long lives. Their sequence is shaped to support a story about heaven's kingship, the flood, and the refounding of order. On another layer, they echo a remembered geography. The scribes did not pick them out of thin air. They chose names attached to real places, with real temples and local traditions, some of which were already ruins in their time. In doing so, they let a faint outline of actual settlement hierarchies show through the mythic paint. Holding both layers together helps avoid 2 temptations. One is to treat the antediluvian section as pure fantasy, unrelated to any historical landscape. The other is to treat it as a straightforward historical record that we simply have not yet confirmed. Neither extreme fits the evidence. What we have instead is a kind of double exposure. Legendary kings walking through cities we can still locate on maps, carrying an office that is at once political memory and theological symbol, all set in an age the text itself marks as fundamentally, almost impossibly different from our own. The first thing almost everyone notices about the antediluvian section is not the cities but the numbers, those reign lengths. Alulim, 28,800 years, Alalgar, 36,000 years, Enmenluana, 43,200 years, Enmengalana, 28,800 years, Dumuzid the Shepherd, 36,000 years, Ensipadzidana, 28,800 years, Enmendurana, 21,000 years, Ubra Tutu of Shurupak, 18,600 years, 8 kings, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. If you read on into the post-flood dynasties, the contrast is almost jarring. Later reigns are long by our standards, but not cosmically long. 60 years, 90 years, sometimes over 100 for a particularly idealized ruler. There are still outliers and suspiciously round totals, but we are in a different order of magnitude. Before the flood, one king rules for what looks like an entire geological epoch. After the flood, kings rule for lengths that a human lifetime could at least imagine. So what is going on with those early numbers? Part of the answer lies in how the Sumerians counted. Mesopotamian scribes did not primarily think in tens and hundreds the way we do. Their basic system was sexagesimal, structured around 60. 60 units made a larger unit. 60 of those made the next, like our minutes and seconds, which are one of the few places where our culture still quietly uses their system. When you look closely at the antediluvian reigns in the original notation, you notice patterns. Many of the numbers are clean sexagesimal constructions. 28,800 is 60 times 60 times 8. 36,000 is 60 times 60 times 10. 43,200 is 60 times 60 times 12. They are built out of squares and multiples of 60, like carved blocks of time arranged according to a mathematical aesthetic. To a modern eye, this can feel arbitrary or absurd, To a Bronze Age scribe trained in place value notation and table memorization, it may have felt elegant. A reign of 60 times 60 times 10 years is not just big, it is orderly. It sits neatly in a grid of possible values. Large numbers in such a system are not just counts, they are also shapes. This doesn't mean the scribes thought no one would ever question the realism of a 43,200-year reign. The king list was being copied by people who kept administrative archives, tax records, legal contracts. They knew roughly how long a king lived. They could see the remains of a few generations back in their own archives. So why inflate the early kings to these stratospheric, beautifully constructed durations? There are a few main options scholars tend to explore. One is symbolic time. On this reading, the pre-flood section deliberately places origins in a qualitatively different temporal regime. Those long reigns are not failed history, they are a way of saying the world before the flood ran on a different clock. By stretching early kings into tens of thousands of years, the list creates a sense of deep, slow time, more like the ages of gods in other traditions than the lifespans of ordinary humans. The flood then becomes not just a disaster, but a boundary between timescales. After it, things move faster, lifetimes contract, political events happen within spans you can actually witness. Another option is ideological grandeur. Here the point is not about time itself, but about the stature of the office. If kingship really did descend from heaven, then its first human bearers had to be almost superhuman. Their reigns are made enormous to express the weight of that role. The first to rule are stretched across cosmic durations because they stand close to the divine source. This impulse is not unique to Mesopotamia. Many royal and priestly genealogies, from Egypt to medieval Europe, lengthen early reigns or pile on extra generations at the front. It is a way of building a high platform under the present. The higher the stack of predecessors, the more impressive the current ruler looks. A third angle sees the numbers as part of a scribble tradition. By the time the most complete forms of the king list were written down, Mesopotamian scribes had centuries of practice in numerical play. Lists of reciprocals, multiplication tables, problems involving fantastically large fields and grain rations. In that environment, plugging prestigious names into numerically satisfying slots would have been a natural move. We can imagine a learned tradition in which particular numbers, 60, 600, 3,600, 36,000, had accumulated symbolic weight. Reusing them in royal contexts might have felt appropriate, much as certain numbers, 7, 12, 40, recur in later Near Eastern texts with layers of resonance attached. None of these interpretations require us to assume that people really lived longer back then. That idea of antediluvian humans with biologically extended lifespans is a much later reading, influenced by other traditions and by a desire to smooth out the dissonance between mythic chronology and biological plausibility. The king list itself does not pause to explain the numbers. It does not say that the nature of the human body was different, or offer any physiological rationale. All it does is state reign lengths. Those reigns are attached to kingship, not to private individuals. A king's years are, in a sense, public time. They mark the duration of an order, not just a person's heartbeat. To say, Dumuzid ruled 36,000 years, is to give his name to a block of world time whose size is defined more by number law and ideology than by flesh. Reading the text responsibly means paying attention to how these numbers behave inside the Mesopotamian cultural system, before importing explanations from outside. When we do that, the need to treat them as literal lifespans fades. What comes forward instead is their rhetorical function. They tell us, the beginning is unimaginably remote. The first cities and their bearers of kingship loom on the horizon of time like mountains. Everything after the flood happens in a contracted, more familiar scale. Seen this way, the extreme reign lengths sharpen the mystery instead of resolving it. They remind us that the king list is not just counting years, it is telling a story about origins, a story in which kingship appears suddenly, fully formed, lodged in Eridu for two perfect blocks of sexagesimally shaped time, then marches northward through other cities, each reign another carefully measured slab of mythic duration. A story in which the flood slices that stretch of cosmic time away from the present and drops it into a before that can be named, but never visited. When we ask what really happened before the Great Flood, the long reigns are both an obstacle and a clue. They block any straightforward reading of the antediluvian section as simple political chronology. At the same time, they signal what mattered most to the scribes, not the exact length of each rule, but the pattern, the sheer spaciousness of the world's first age, the deliberate mathematical grandeur of the office that had, once upon a time, come down from heaven. If the king list gives us the skeleton of that first age, names, cities, impossible spans of time, the Eridu Genesis is one of the places where a little bit of flesh appears on those bones. Calling it the Eridu Genesis makes it sound like a tidy book you can pull off a shelf. It isn't. What we have is a single broken clay tablet copied in the early 2nd millennium BCE, probably in Nippur. Large pieces of it are missing, whole lines are gone. Others trail off into nothing just as they're about to get interesting. And yet, in the fragments that survive, you can see the outline of an enormous story. It opens, as many Mesopotamian compositions do, in a wide, still frame. The gods, the world, the first cities. The beginning is damaged, but the sense of it can be followed. The great gods decide that humans should exist. The text alludes to shaping black-headed people, a standard Sumerian term for humankind. It speaks of forming them, of giving them life and a way of living. Very quickly, cities appear. Not just any cities, but the same constellation we met in the king list. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Places where kingship descended, where order took root. In the Eridu Genesis, however, these early cities are not only political units. They are part of a divine project. The gods are not just crowning kings, they are arranging a world. The text tells of temples being founded, rites being established, perhaps irrigation and agriculture being organized. The gods are described in council, distributing responsibilities. Human beings are given work, but also stability. The world is in balance. Then something changes. The tablet here is frustrating. We know there is a transition, because suddenly we find ourselves in the middle of a divine decision. The gods have turned against their own creation. They have resolved on a flood. Later flood stories from Mesopotamia, Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, will give reasons for this choice. Human noise, overcrowding, the disturbance of divine rest. The Eridu Genesis may have contained something like that, but the key lines are either damaged or gone. What we can see is the result. An assembly of gods deciding that the cities they had just established will be swept away. The ordered world of Eridu and its sister cities is going to be unmade. At this point, another familiar figure steps into the light, a single human being singled out for warning. His name appears in the broken text as Ziusudra, the king and priest of Shuruppak. The king list had ended its antediluvian section with Ubaratutu of Shuruppak as the last king before the flood. The Eridu Genesis gives us his successor, or perhaps his counterpart in another strand of the tradition, a ruler who will bridge the gap between before and after. We are told that Ziusudra is devoted, pious, attentive to the divine. He stands constantly in the temple. He listens. That listening is what saves him. In one of the most evocative moments the fragments preserve, a god quietly reveals the plan. The lines are broken, but scholars restore something like a voice from the wall of the reed hut, or from behind the wall telling Ziusudra that a flood is coming, that a decision to destroy the seed of mankind has been taken. The exact mechanics of this message, whether it is the god Enki/Ea speaking through a wall, as in later versions, or some other revelatory scene, are hard to pin down. The broken edges of the tablet become very literal limits on what we can say, but the motif is clear enough. The gods resolve on a global act of destruction. One god, unwilling to see the whole project erased, bends the rules and passes a warning to a human who has shown himself worthy of trust. Ziusudra is told to build something, almost certainly a boat, though the tablet is very damaged at precisely this point. He is to preserve the seed of all living things. He is, in Sumerian terms, to carry over the royal and ritual order into whatever world comes after the flood. When the waters come, the description is brief but intense. The storm wind roars. The flood rages 7 days and 7 nights. The great boat is lifted like a reed, drifting over where cities once stood, and then, suddenly, stillness. The storm stops. The sun comes out. Ziusudra opens a window. He prostrates himself before the light. He performs offerings. The reaction in heaven is not simple regret or anger, it is evaluation. The tablet preserves a scene in which the great god Enlil discovers that humans have survived, and is, at first, furious that his decree of annihilation has been thwarted. But another god, most interpreters think it is again Enki, argues that total destruction was excessive, that preserving a remnant was wise. What follows is delicate. Ziusudra is not just spared, he is rewarded. The text tells us he is granted life like a god, given a place in Dilmun, a distant pure land at the edges of the world. At the same time, the flood has done its work. The impossibly long ages the antediluvian city order are over. Something more limited, more stable begins. Seen this way, the flood in the Eridu Genesis is not merely punitive, it is corrective. The gods are restoring a tolerable balance between the divine and human realms. They are wiping away an initial version of the world that, for reasons the text only hints at, had become unsustainable. But they are also preserving continuity. They do not start again from absolute zero. They choose one city, one king-priest, one set of rituals to carry across. The warning to Ziusudra is therefore not a random act of compassion in an otherwise capricious universe. It is part of how the story explains the persistence of order across a catastrophic break. From our perspective, the fragile clay tablet itself mirrors this logic. It is an artifact that has survived multiple destructions, fires, collapses, the long erosion of time, but only partially. Its intact lines carry over a pattern. Its losses mark the gaps. There are things we can say with some confidence, that the narrative began with human creation and city founding, that a divine council chose a flood, that one human, Ziusudra, received a warning, built a craft, survived, and was granted a kind of semi-divine afterlife, that the flood marks a hinge between an old way of being and a new, contracted one. And there are things we simply cannot reconstruct. We do not know exactly why the gods grew dissatisfied. The key words in the lost section might have pointed to noise, population, impiety, or something else entirely. We do not have a full description of the vessel Ziusudra built, only scattered signs that look very much like the later tradition's ark. We lack the closing lines that would have stated, in the composer's own terms, what lesson the audience was meant to take. Modern editors fill some of these gaps with careful comparisons, to Atrahasis, to the flood tablet of Gilgamesh, to later echoes in other cultures. There is a reasonable case that all these stories draw on a shared stock of images and ideas. But in a sleep-quiet room, with the broken text in mind, it is worth letting the silences stand. A flood decreed, a warning whispered, a boat on deep water, a survivor stepping out into a cleaned, unfamiliar world. The Eridu Genesis lets us glimpse how ancient Mesopotamians imagined the end of that first, mathematically vast age, not as pure obliteration, but as a hard reset that still somehow carried a thread of kingship and ritual across the waters. In the next tradition, that thread of warning and survival will be woven into a different kind of problem. Not cosmic time, not city lists, but something much more mundane and strangely modern. The gods, in that story, will not be angry with humanity in general. They will be tired of the racket. Atrahasis is the name of a person and the title of a story. The person, whose name means something like exceedingly wise, is the human protagonist. The story is an old Babylonian Akkadian composition from the early 2nd millennium BCE, preserved on several tablets, some more damaged than others. Compared to the fragile hints of the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis feels almost luxurious. Long stretches survive, the plot is clearer, and crucially, this is the first Mesopotamian flood narrative that gives a fully articulated reason for the catastrophe. It comes down to noise. The epic begins before there are any humans at all. The junior gods are doing all the work, digging canals, raising dikes, maintaining the cosmic infrastructure, and they are exhausted. They mutiny. Under cover of night, they surround the house of Enlil, the high god, tools in their hands. The text doesn't describe a bloodbath. Instead, it shows something more revealing, a negotiation. The great gods hold council. The rebel deities explain that the workload is unbearable. Rather than crush the revolt, the gods decide on a structural solution. They will create a new kind of being to carry the load. Here, Atrahasis overlaps conceptually with the Eridu Genesis and other Mesopotamian creation accounts. Humans are made to relieve the gods of labour, to tend fields and canals, to keep temples supplied. A god is sacrificed, his blood mixed with clay, and from this mixture, with the cooperation of a birth goddess, humankind is formed. At first, this seems to work beautifully. The gods withdraw from manual labour, humans take over, offerings rise to the temples, the divine assembly can rest. Then the arithmetic of life kicks in. Humans reproduce, they don't stop. The text moves in large time jumps. After 1,200 years, after another 1,200, and with each step the population increases. More people means more activity. Agriculture, herding, building, feasting, singing, crying. The world becomes loud. Atrahasis gives this a very simple name: noise. It is not a moral category, at least not at first. The humans aren't accused of wickedness or sacrilege. They're not described as violent or corrupt in the way later traditions will frame things. They are simply too many and too noisy, especially for Enlil, who is portrayed as needing his peace. The crucial line describes how the humans' clamour keeps Enlil from sleeping. This is the boundary that the story is interested in. The gods are supposed to enjoy rest, a quiet, elevated existence. Humans are supposed to work and worship. But if human activity swells past a certain point, it pushes into divine space. The sound of life, multiplied by centuries of unchecked fertility, becomes an intrusion. The first response is not the flood, it is regulation. Enlil proposes targeted measures, the other gods agree, famine is sent. Then a period of disease. The text speaks of cutting off food, blocking the womb, sending down a plague god. These are attempts to push human numbers back into a tolerable range, without destroying the species altogether. Each time, the measures fail, not because they are ineffective, but because another god, Enki, or Ea, quietly undermines them. This is where the story's ethical tension begins to crystallize. Enki is the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts. He is also consistently the one who favors human survival. In Atrahasis, he does not openly defy the council. He does something more subtle. When plague hits, he instructs Atrahasis and his people in rituals and offerings that will propitiate the plague god and bring relief. When famine comes, he suggests changing offerings so that the famine deity is satisfied and departs. Each divine attempt at population control is answered by a human divine workaround. Enlil grows more frustrated. From his perspective, the agreement is being sabotaged. The humans remain noisy. The noise remains unbearable. The escalation is mapped step by step in the text. Each disaster is longer and harsher than the last. The suffering on the ground is not ignored. People starve. Parents eat seed grain meant for planting. The narrative gives heartbreaking glimpses of mothers withhold food from their children, of families breaking apart. The cost of noise control is real, and yet each time Enki's sympathy bends the rules just enough to allow recovery. Finally, Enlil calls an uncompromising council. There will be one more measure, this time no half steps. He proposes a flood that will wipe out humankind entirely, and to make sure his decision stands, the gods are bound by oath not to reveal the plan. At this point the story could become a simple tale of divine cruelty. But Atrahasis does something more complicated. Enki swears the oath along with the others. Then he finds a way to keep both his promise and his conscience. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis. Instead, he addresses a wall or a reed fence, with Atrahasis on the other side, technically maintaining the letter of the divine non-disclosure while violating its intent. He tells the wall that a flood will come, that the gods have sworn to annihilate the seed of mankind. He gives precise instructions: tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life. Load the craft with the seed of all living things and your family. When the signal comes, board it and seal the door. The epic moves through the preparation almost briskly. Atrahasis obeys without recorded protest. He constructs a vessel built to exact dimensions, pitched inside and out. Neighbours and elders mock and question him. He deflects with a half-truth about going to dwell with Enki. There is no long theological debate, just a sense of anxious, methodical haste. Then the flood arrives. Atrahasis describes a storm that begins as a darkening of the sky, then escalates into roaring winds and walls of water. Even the gods are terrified. The birth goddess, who helped create humanity, weeps and regrets her role. The divine assembly huddles like frightened dogs at the edge of heaven. The flood rages for days. The text varies by recension, but in the Old Babylonian version it is intense and relatively brief. When it ends, Atrahasis opens a window. He sees that humanity has been wiped out. He offers a sacrifice. The smell rises, and the gods, who have been starving without offerings, gather like flies around the sacrifice. It is a vivid, almost uncomfortable image. The gods need what humans provide. Enlil, discovering that some humans have survived, is furious. His decree has been circumvented again. He storms into the council, demanding to know which god betrayed the oath. Enki does not deny his role. Instead, he reframes the entire issue. He argues that total annihilation was unnecessary. If the problem was human noise, there were other tools available. Why not impose measures that limit fertility? Why not send specific plagues, or designate certain social rules, instead of erasing the whole species? The text at this point articulates a sort of ancient policy debate. They agree on new regulations, shorter human lifespans, women who are devoted to the gods and do not bear children, certain classes of priestesses and tabooed relationships that effectively cap reproduction. The flood becomes the last uncontrolled spike in population, after which a managed, bounded humanity will continue. Atrahasis himself, like Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis, is granted a special status. Some versions imply he's taken away to live at the mouth of the rivers in a distant, almost mythic space separated from ordinary mortality. His role in the story is not just to survive, but to model attentive obedience and to carry ritual knowledge across a civilizational break. What might all of this be encoding? On one level, Atrahasis is explicit. It is a theodicy of noise. The flood is not arbitrary. It is the culmination of an escalating struggle to balance divine rest with human proliferation. The problem is not moral evil. It is overcrowding, the sheer density of life pressing up against the gods. Some scholars see in this an echo of real anxieties. Population growth in irrigated Mesopotamian regions, strain on food supplies, outbreaks of epidemic disease in crowded cities. The sequence of famine, plague, and flood may be a narrative way of talking about recurrent crises in an early urban world that suddenly had more people than its systems could comfortably support. Others emphasize the cosmic dimension. The story dramatizes the idea that the universe has carrying capacities, limits to how much of any one thing it can sustain without destabilizing. Too many humans disrupt divine calm. Too much divine wrath risks collapsing the very arrangement that provides the gods with food and worship. The final compromise, shorter lives, regulated fertility, preserved rituals, reads like an attempt to articulate a long-term sustainable equilibrium between heaven and earth. Reading Atrahasis beside the Eridu Genesis, a pattern emerges. These are not just tales of destruction, they are meditations on adjustment. A world is founded, it grows beyond its intended scale, the balance tips, and then a crisis forces a renegotiation of boundaries. Some knowledge survives across the break, guarded by a single, exceedingly wise human, but the conditions of life after are deliberately narrower than before. In the next layer of tradition, this balancing act will expand from the volume of human noise to the politics of the gods themselves. Because if the flood in Atrahasis is triggered by clamour from below, the next stories will suggest that a different kind of disturbance, arguments in the divine council, conflicts of interest among the gods, can be just as destabilizing. In all of these stories, the flood does not come from a lone, all-powerful will snapping its fingers. It comes out of a meeting. Mesopotamian texts return to this image again and again. The gods assembled, sitting in council, speaking, swearing, arguing, sometimes sulking in silence while decisions are made that none of them can fully control once set in motion. In Atrahasis, we've already seen fragments of this. The junior gods mutiny, but the resolution is hammered out in an assembly. Enlil proposes measures, other deities assent, Enki quietly resists. When the final flood decree is made, it is not Enlil acting in a vacuum. It is a high-stakes session of the divine board, complete with oaths of secrecy. Other texts from the same world repeat the pattern with slightly different casts. In the Sumerian flood traditions, Enlil often appears as the champion of the order, or at least of a particular vision of order. Cities under his authority, boundaries respected, noise contained. Anu, the sky god, may preside as an elder figure, a kind of chairman of the board. Enki, Ea in Akkadian, sits in his own domain of wisdom and waters, not above the others but beside them, weighing the consequences. Birth goddesses like Nintu or Mami are there too, with their own investments in the survival of the creatures they helped bring into being. The texts are fragmentary, but the structure is recognizable. A problem is presented. The gods debate. A decision is announced as a decree of the council, often described in terms of fates being fixed, destinies inscribed. Within that pattern, different divine roles emerge. Some gods function as enforcers. Enlil is the clearest example. He demands quiet, initiates punitive measures, insists that decisions, once taken, be carried through. Storm gods like Adad or Ishka will later serve as his instruments, unleashing winds and rain when called upon. Others serve as protectors. Enki's role is almost consistent across centuries. He is the one who knows too much to be comfortable with total annihilation. He engineers workarounds, teaches rituals, issues warnings in carefully coded ways. Occasionally a birth goddess joins this protective tendency, crying out against destruction, lamenting the loss of her human children. And then there are the quiet dissenters. These are not always named. Sometimes they appear only as the gods trembling during the flood, regretting their oath, but still bound by it. In a few passages, individual deities are said to sit apart, or to keep silent during a crucial vote. Their dissent is registered not in open rebellion but in later tears, in the hunger that drives them to swarm around the first post-flood sacrifice. This layered presentation of divine wills does something very particular. It makes the cosmos morally ambiguous. In a single deity system, a disaster easily becomes a direct statement. This happened because one mind wanted it. In a council, catastrophe can be the outcome of disagreement, of compromise, of bad forecasting. No one god is completely in control, and no god is entirely innocent either. Enlil is not simply evil for wanting human noise reduced. His position is intelligible within the story's logic. Enki is not purely good. His interventions have consequences, including prolonged suffering during partially thwarted disasters. The birth goddess is compassionate, but her earlier choice to participate in human creation is one of the reasons the crisis exists at all. The council motif takes this tangle of motives and stages it. You can almost hear the arguments beneath the broken lines of cuneiform. How much suffering is acceptable? How far can we push a species before we destroy the system that feeds us? What counts as keeping an oath if the literal wording can be bent? Secrecy is essential to this drama. When Enlil calls for an oath in Atrahasis, he's trying to lock the council into unity. No warnings, no leaks, no escape routes. The flood must be absolute, and the only way to ensure that is to bind every god with a spoken sacred constraint. The story then turns that constraint into the engine of its plot. Enki's solution, speaking to a wall with Atrahasis listening on the other side, relies on the difference between the spirit and the letter of the oath. Technically, he does not tell a man. Functionally, he completely undercuts the plan. Other Mesopotamian narratives play with similar gaps. Sometimes a dream carries a warning, delivered indirectly. Sometimes a symbol, like the command to tear down your house and build a boat, is ambiguous enough that the god can claim not to have revealed everything explicitly. The divine world in these stories is one where promises matter, but so does cleverness in navigating those promises. For listeners in ancient Mesopotamia, this may have resonated with real experiences of power. Kings, city councils, temple assemblies, these were human institutions that also met, debated, swore oaths, and sometimes leaked. Decisions about irrigation, warfare, taxation, and justice were not always unanimous. There were factions, quiet opponents, compromises that satisfied no one completely. Some scholars see the divine councils of Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, and later epics as narrative mirrors of this political reality. The gods behave like an idealized, or perhaps exaggerated, version of elite councils in early states. Flood and famine become the cosmic scale analogues of royal decrees and policy mistakes. Others are more cautious. They point out that we have limited direct evidence for the procedures of actual city councils in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The divine assemblies may be less like historical transcripts and more like a familiar storytelling frame, a way to make sense of why events feel both fated and contested at the same time. Either way, the motif matters for how these flood stories feel. Instead of a clean moral line, humans bad, God angry, punishment falls, we get something messier. Human noise is annoying, but human offerings are necessary. Annihilation solves one problem and creates another. Gods disagree, change their minds, regret, and then try to design better rules for the next age. The secrecy and the leaks, the oaths and the loopholes, all underline this tension. The hero is saved not because the council suddenly discovers mercy, but because one god decides that the council's decision must be bent in order to preserve a future. Survival slips through a crack in the system, carried by someone exceedingly wise, who listens closely enough to hear a warning that was not meant officially to be heard. From the outside, centuries later, we can read this in at least two ways. As a narrative device, it is brilliant. It creates suspense, complicates characters, and gives the storyteller multiple points of view on a single crisis. The council scenes are where motive and consequence are laid bare. As a possible window onto ritual and governance, it is suggestive but not decisive. The idea of the gods meeting in assembly aligns with inscriptions that speak of human councils, and with temple rituals that reenact divine decisions. But we cannot simply map one onto the other. For the purposes of the flood stories, what matters most is how the council holds together conflict. It allows the text to say, in effect, the world is not run by a single simple will. It is shaped by negotiations among powers with overlapping and sometimes clashing interests. Disasters are not pure randomness, but neither are they simple retribution. They are what happens when a divided heaven tries, and often fails, to manage a noisy earth. The next great flood account to crystallize in this tradition will keep the council, but shift its focus. Atrahasis and his quiet warning will give way to a different kind of protagonist, a restless king whose personal quest intersects with the oldest of decisions, and whose story preserves the flood in a new, more elaborate frame. By the time the story of the flood finds its way into the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is no longer standing alone. It has been folded into a much larger question. Not why did the gods send the waters, but what does it mean to be a mortal who knows he must die? Gilgamesh, as the epic presents him, is not a quiet sage or a humble survivor. He is a king who begins his story as a problem. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, violently energetic, trampling his own people in the name of glory. The early tablets show him wrestling monsters, defying decrees, cutting down forests that should not be cut. And then death enters his world in a way he cannot ignore. His companion Enkidu dies, slowly, painfully, under the weight of a divine sentence. No amount of strength or royal power can stop it. Gilgamesh watches the body decay, hears the flies buzzing, and something in him breaks. The epic tells us that he is seized by terror, not just grief. He suddenly realizes that whatever he has built, however high the city walls of Uruk may rise, he too will lie down in dust. So he does the one thing a king in this imaginative universe is not supposed to do. He abandons his city and goes wandering in search of a way out. This is the road that brings him much later in the poem to Utnapishtim, the man whom the gods carried through the flood and then set apart. Not in a palace, not on a throne, but at the mouth of the rivers, on a distant shore beyond ordinary human reach. In Atrahasis and the older Sumerian traditions, the flood hero is the focal point. He is the one who receives the warning, builds the ship, rides out the storm, and performs the sacrifice that persuades the gods to limit future destructions. In Gilgamesh, the same figure is still there, but his role has changed. He has become an answer to a question: can a human being escape death? When Gilgamesh finally reaches him, emaciated from travel, dressed in skins, still radiating that stubborn refusal to accept his fate, Utnapishtim does not greet him with secrets. He answers the king's plea with a kind of weariness. Why, he asks in effect, do you pursue what is not given to humans? When the gods created mankind, they kept life in their own hands. Only when pressed does he tell his own story, and as he speaks, the flood that we met in Atrahasis is retold in a new key. The narrative beats are familiar. There is a warning, framed as before in roundabout language. A boat must be built, but not just any boat. The tablet gives us precise dimensions, compartments, layers of pitch and bitumen, a floating household, warehouse, and shrine all in one. There is the storm, The text lingers on its violence, speaking of winds like battalions, of darkness so thick that even the gods are afraid. The divine council that planned the flood now cowers before its force. Ishtar, looking down, laments that she ever consented to this destruction. The birth goddess weeps for her children turned to clay. Inside the ark, Utnapishtim and his people can only listen. The waters rage, the ship is tossed, no horizon can be seen. For 6 days and nights the flood covers the land. Then, suddenly, silence. The boat comes to rest against a mountain. Utnapishtim waits, then begins sending out birds to test the world. First a dove, which returns because it finds no resting place. Then a swallow, with the same result. Finally a raven, which does not come back. Only then does he open the hatch and see that the tops of the mountains are dry. The next action is not to claim land or plant fields. It is to build an altar. Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice, and the gods, in one of the epic's most striking images, gather like flies over the smoke. The flood that was meant to silence human noise has also deprived the gods of their regular offerings. They are hungry. They are moved. They are, in some sense, embarrassed by what they have done. In this version, divine regret is explicit. Ishtar publicly swears by the necklace around her neck that she will remember these days, and never again consent to such a total annihilation. Enlil arrives, angry that anyone has survived, but he is confronted by the other gods. Enki, as in Atrahasis, argues that it is irrational to destroy everyone when more targeted measures could address human excess. Plague, famine, wild beasts. The council does not undo the flood. It cannot. But it does set new limits for the future. And then comes the decision that will haunt Gilgamesh's conversation. Utnapishtim and his wife are singled out, not just saved, not just blessed, but removed from the human condition. Until now, Enlil says, Utnapishtim was mortal. From now on, he and his wife shall be like us. They are carried away to live far from ordinary cities and ordinary fates. Immortality, in other words, is not a general reward for righteousness. It is a one-time, unrepeatable outcome of a cosmic crisis. This is what the flood tablet emphasizes when it sits inside the epic. The flood is not primarily an explanation for the shape of the earth, or the reason why layers of silt appear in the ground. It is a remembered turning point when the gods, confronted with the consequences of their own decree, imposed long-term constraints on themselves and on humanity. Never again a total reset. Never again an immortal human who gets to ride the catastrophe into a new, ageless life. For Gilgamesh, hearing this, the story is both a revelation and a wall. On one hand, it confirms that death is not built into the fabric of things as an absolute necessity. A human once crossed that line. A council once changed the rules. On the other hand, it underscores that this was an exception that proves the rule. The same divine regret that limited future floods has also closed the door on future immortalities. The gods themselves insist that what happened with Utnapishtim cannot and must not happen again. Scholars often point out that this tablet is not inventing the flood story from scratch. It is reshaping older Babylonian and Sumerian materials, the Eridu Genesis, versions of Atrahasis, local traditions about Ziusudra, and threading them into a new literary structure. Formulaic lines, stock phrases, even technical details of the boat seem to echo earlier works. But the framing is different. The older texts tell the flood to explain how humans survived, why sacrifices matter, and why our lives now have certain limits. Gilgamesh uses the flood as a remembered boundary marker. It becomes part of a meditation on what it means to seek permanence in a world where even the gods can regret, revise, and run out of second chances. By embedding the flood within a king's failed quest for eternal life, the epic quietly shifts our attention. The real question is no longer how do we avoid the next deluge, but what does a mortal do, knowing there will be no ark for him? The answer, for Gilgamesh, will not be found on distant shores or in forbidden councils, but back in the city he left behind. Before we follow him there, though, we need to look more closely at the flood hero himself, and at his older Sumerian name. Because in that earlier figure, Ziusudra, later Utnapishtim, the line between memory and myth becomes even more intricate. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor of the flood is Utnapishtim, he who saw life, or in some readings, he found life. In the Akkadian language of the epic, that is the name that anchors the story. But if we step back into earlier texts and a different language, we meet someone else. In the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the flood hero is called Ziusudra. In later Old Babylonian versions of Atrahasis, the same function is carried by a figure named Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. 3 names, 3 languages, 1 narrative role. Scholars are fairly confident that we are not looking at 3 different historical individuals, each of whom built an ark in turn. Instead, we are watching a single traditional figure being translated and retold across centuries, city-states, and scribal schools. Ziusudra is Sumerian. His name is often glossed as something like "he who lengthened days" or "life of long days." Atrahasis is Akkadian and highlights intelligence rather than lifespan. Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh tablets adds another layer. He is the one who has found life by passing through destruction. The underlying storyline stays remarkably stable. In each version, the gods decide on a flood that will wipe out humanity. One deity, Enki in Sumerian, Ea in Akkadian, quietly rebels against the totality of that plan. He gives a warning in indirect language. A boat is built. The hero loads aboard the seed of life, humans and animals, precious goods. The storm comes. The waters cover the land. The boat grounds on a mountain. Birds are sent out. After disembarking, the survivor offers a sacrifice. The gods, faced with the smell of the offering and the reality of their own overreaction, change their policy. The same scaffolding supports all 3 names. What shifts is emphasis, what each audience is meant to notice in the survivor. Ziusudra, in the Eridu Genesis, is above all a pious king. The text calls him a humble man, devout, the one who regularly stands in the temple and listens. His salvation flows not from tricking the gods, but from being the sort of person a god can approach. Enki does not have to search far for a candidate. Ziusudra is already in the courtyard, already attentive. When the god speaks through the wall of the shrine, the king's response is not argument or negotiation. It is obedience. He follows instructions, rides out the flood, and when he steps onto dry ground, his first public act is worship. Atrahasis, by contrast, is very wise. His name advertises cleverness, not quiet devotion. In the Old Babylonian Atrahasis poem, the human side of the story is more talkative. The hero questions, complains, weeps. He is caught in a long dispute between labouring humans and overburdened junior gods, a dispute that eventually produces the flood. When the warning comes, Atrahasis has to navigate not just practical instructions about the boat, but social obligations, nosy neighbours, and the need to keep divine secrets. His behaviour is not passive. He bargains. He devises a cover story. He manages household logistics under impossible time pressure. His sacrifice at the end is still crucial, but the poem invites us to admire his resourcefulness as much as his reverence. By the time we meet Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, both strands, piety and intelligence, are present, but they are reframed. Gilgamesh does not see Utnapishtim build the ship or face his community. Those episodes are in the past. What he encounters is the aftermath. A survivor who has been living for generations in a place set apart, looking back on a decision that cannot be repeated. Utnapishtim's defining trait here is not his earlier obedience or even his wisdom. It is his status. He has stepped out of the normal human story. Gilgamesh calls him the faraway. The text emphasizes not his inner qualities, but the gap between him and everyone else. Immortal, remote, unrepeatable. Across the versions, even the reward changes its flavor. For Ziusudra, the Sumerian text hints that life like a god and lasting breath are given to him after the flood. He is placed in Dilmun, a pure, distant land somewhere at the edges of the imagined world. The focus is on enduring life in a special place, a kind of gentle removal from ordinary time. Atrahasis does not always receive explicit immortality in surviving fragments. In some reconstructions, the poem may have ended with his being granted a long life or a special relationship with a deity, but the emphasis is less on eternal existence and more on his role in negotiating a new balance between gods and humans, birth limits, mortality, and the rhythms that will govern future generations. In Gilgamesh, the reward is the sharpest and most paradoxical. Utnapishtim and his wife are given literal immortality, but the gift comes wrapped in isolation. They no longer live among cities. They do not rule. They do not return to found a dynasty. Their life is, in a sense, a long exile at the mouth of the waters. Longevity, distance, special favour. Each text plays with the same package in a different way. The direction of travel is almost the opposite of what we might expect. We sometimes imagine myths starting vague and becoming more detailed over time. Here, early Sumerian tradition gives us a spare outline: a devout king, a flood, a blessing, a removal to a pure land. Later, Akkadian poems add conversation, psychological texture, and sharper theological argument. By the time of Gilgamesh, the story has become self-conscious. It knows it is old. It refers back to earlier forms, even as it rearranges them for a new literary purpose. This is why variant names and versions matter so much. They are not just corruptions of an original text that we want to reconstruct and then ignore. They are evidence that the flood story was alive, moving between temples and scribal workshops, being retold to different audiences with different concerns. A Sumerian court might have wanted to hear that a righteous king attentive in ritual could be the hinge of history. An old Babylonian household hearing Atrahasis might have resonated more with an ancestor who argues, suffers, and thinks his way through divine decrees. Listeners to Gilgamesh in first millennium Mesopotamia were invited to ponder the loneliness of exceptional fate and the impossibility of imitating it. When we line these figures up, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, we are not forced to choose which one is real. Instead, we can see continuity and change interwoven. The stable core suggests a long memory of some great catastrophe, or at least of a story that functioned as if it were such a memory. The shifting portrayals tell us how communities use that story to think through their own anxieties, about kingship, about obedience, about the cost of survival and the limits of divine favour. And as we watch the same survivor take on different names and attributes, another question opens. If the hero and his reward can be reshaped so fluidly, what about the flood itself? How might the physical event behind the story, or the absence of any single event, look when we step out of tablets and into the landscape? If we follow that question out beyond the clay tablets, the phrase that keeps returning is simple and stubborn: the Great Flood. The Sumerian king list has it. Eridu Genesis has it. Atrahasis and Gilgamesh inherit it. In each, the flood is a singular turning point that divides a before from an after. Yet the physical world almost never works in singulars. When we try to imagine what a great flood could have been in the real landscapes of southern Mesopotamia, what we see instead is a whole family of possibilities. The first and most obvious candidate is a river flood. Sumer grew up between two rivers that were both gift and threat. The Tigris and Euphrates are flashy, unpredictable systems. They can swell rapidly with snowmelt from the mountains, or with heavy rains falling far upstream. For people living on the flat alluvial plain, with canals and levees cut into the earth, a breach at the wrong moment could turn fields and neighbourhoods into a shallow inland sea. Archaeology shows clear signs that early cities in this region dealt repeatedly with flood damage. At levels corresponding to the early dynastic period, layers of water-laid silt interrupt building phases in several sites. At some tells, we see houses abandoned after inundation, rebuilt on raised platforms, or shifted to slightly higher ground nearby. These are not global cataclysms. They are regional disasters that feel global if your known world is a cluster of towns along a river. When a spring flood sweeps away your irrigation works, drowns your livestock, erases the markers of fields and streets, it can feel as though creation itself has been unmade. The horizon is water. The landmarks that anchor memory are gone. Survival may depend on a single boat, a fortunate mound, or the decision to seek refuge in a temple built on a higher terrace. From the point of view of a later storyteller, the flood that destroyed our father's city is already a great flood, but river floods are only part of the picture. The southern end of Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE was not the same as the modern coastline. Sea level, delta growth, and shifting river mouths created a changing zone of marsh, lagoon, and shoreline. Under certain conditions, storm surges from the Gulf could push far inland, overtopping banks and turning low-lying settlements into temporary islands. Imagine a powerful storm driving water upriver into a landscape already saturated by heavy rains. Levees fail in several places at once. Drainage channels spill backward. What starts as a coastal surge becomes a broad, shallow inundation spreading for miles. To people on the ground, it might not be obvious that this was a compound event. rainfall plus river swell plus surge. All they would see is water rising past the normal safe marks, past the thresholds their grandparents had told them were the worst in living memory. Sometimes the only safe places would be the very structures that myths later seize upon: temple platforms, ziggurat foundations, the highest parts of town. In those moments, the boundary between sacred architecture and literal refuge blurs. A god's house becomes, very practically, a vessel of survival. There is also the longer, slower kind of flood that does not arrive as a single storm at all. Over centuries, the alluvial plain can sink through compaction, while river channels wander. An area that was once dry farmland may gradually become marsh, then open water. From a geological view, this is normal delta behavior. From a human view, it can be read as divine withdrawal, lands taken back by the waters, cities left behind as islands or tells, surrounded by reeds. When an old text says that the flood swept away the cities of old, it may be referring not to one day of violence, but to the cumulative effect of decades of rising water tables and failing embankments, telescoped in memory into a single decisive act. All of this points us toward a more general truth. Great is a relative word. For a modern reader, saturated with images of satellite weather and global maps, the phrase Great Flood easily conjures a planet-wide event. For a Sumerian scribe whose mental map was a network of cities, canals, and nearby hills, the total destruction of that network could be experienced as, and spoken of as, the end of the world. A flood that wipes out 5 or 6 key city-states in the lower plain might as well be cosmic if those cities are the centres of writing, worship, and power. The fact that life goes on, unnoticed, hundreds of kilometres away in some upland valley, would not soften the blow for those who saw their entire horizon vanish underwater. This is where cultural transmission enters the story. Disasters are rarely allowed to stay as mere bad weather. They are interpreted, retold, wired into ritual and lore. A particularly devastating inundation might become the story that explains why a dynasty fell, why a new city rose to prominence, why certain rituals of appeasing the river or the storm god are now required every year. In that process, the event becomes what scholars sometimes call a boundary myth, a story that marks off one era from another and gives that boundary meaning. Before the flood, kingship was in one city. After the flood, it was transferred. Before the flood, humans were too numerous. After the flood, we live under new rules. The water becomes the hinge on which the moral and political world swings. Over time, separate floods can be drawn into the same gravitational field. One city remembers the year the river carved a new course and left its fields ruined. Another recalls a generation when unseasonal rains collapsed granaries and walls. A third records a storm that overtopped levees across the plain. Each leaves its own local chronicles, laments, and ritual responses. Centuries later, a scribe compiling king lists or cultic histories does not experience these as wholly independent events. Standing at his tablet, he is looking back across a landscape already shaped by tradition. He may fold multiple memories into a single stylized great flood, placed at a convenient point between mythic antiquity and more checkable history. This does not mean he is inventing freely. It means he is working the way human memory usually works, compressing, selecting, giving scattered trauma a narrative centre. Different stories then crystallize around that centre. One tradition imagines a single righteous king warned in advance. Another emphasizes the god's overreaction and regret. A third uses the flood as an explanation for why human lifespan shortened. On the physical level, we are probably looking at many wet years and many ruined towns. On the cultural level, we are looking at the construction of one archetypal flood, capital F. At this point, it is important to draw a boundary of our own. Saying that certain kinds of floods are plausible candidates is not the same as proving that any particular text is describing any particular event. Clay tablets are not seismographs. They are works of literature, theology, and royal ideology, created long after the periods they claim to narrate. Archaeologists can point to flood deposits under some early Mesopotamian sites. Geologists can chart sea level change and river shifts. Historians can trace how a story evolves from Ziusudra to Utnapishtim, but none of this lets us point at a specific sediment layer and say with confidence, this is the flood of the king list, or here is the water that carried Ziusudra's boat. What we can say is that people in southern Mesopotamia lived in a flood-shaped world. They watched rivers rise and fall, saw cities damaged and rebuilt, inherited songs about waters that erase boundaries. When they reached for a way to think about the end of an age, they reached, unsurprisingly, for water. When they wanted to imagine divine judgment or reset, they turned the familiar threat of inundation into a cosmic scale model. The result is the flood tradition as we now meet it, a convergence of geography, memory, and imagination. Somewhere in that convergence, there may be the dim outline of specific storms and surges, but even if the physical events remain unidentifiable, the stories they seeded became something more than weather reports. They became the line that divides before from after in Mesopotamian thought. And on the far side of that line, as the waters recede in the texts, we begin to see something else taking shape, a new order of cities, laws, and stories built on the claim that the world after the flood is fundamentally different from the world before. When we turn from the stories to the soil, the questions change their shape. Texts talk about a single, world-resetting flood. Archaeology, by its nature, is better at seeing patterns, repeated damage, repeated rebuilding, long rhythms of settlement and abandonment. What in practice can archaeologists test when they go looking for a great flood? The first category is straightforward: flood deposits. In a tell, that layered mound that forms when a settlement is built and rebuilt on the same spot, an inundation can leave its mark as a distinct band of fine, water-laid silt cutting across the normal accumulation of hearth ash, broken pottery, and building debris. Sometimes you can see a sharp boundary, rubble from collapsed walls, then a clean sheet of mud, then, above it, a new floor surface, or a new row of bricks. At several early Mesopotamian sites we do find such bands. Levels associated with early urban phases are interrupted by thick layers of river silt or alluvial mud, in some cases 1/2 metre deep or more. Above them, new houses rise, often slightly reoriented or built on a higher platform, as if their inhabitants had decided to treat the flood not just as a setback, but as a lesson. The second category is settlement breaks. Archaeologists map when a site is occupied and when it is silent. Sometimes, around the period that later texts call before the flood, we find abrupt interruptions in the sequence. A city that had been growing suddenly stops for a generation or more. In extreme cases, the mound shows no building at all for a century. Then a new phase of occupation begins with different pottery styles, different building plans, even different preferred deities. Floods are only one possible reason for such breaks. War, epidemic, salinization of farmland, shifts in trade routes, all can push people to leave. But when a hiatus lines up with a flood layer, or when several neighbouring sites show similar damage at roughly the same time, the case for a major hydrological disturbance becomes stronger. The third category is rebuilding phases. Southern Mesopotamian cities are famous for being reconstructed again and again on top of their own ruins. Careful excavation sometimes reveals a telling pattern, a phase of heavy flood damage, then a rebuilding that includes thicker foundations, higher terraces, new drainage channels, or a deliberate shift of the city centre to slightly higher ground. In those moments, we are watching in slow motion what myth compresses into a single line. After the flood, the cities were founded anew. But as soon as we start to see these traces, we run into the limits. No site in Mesopotamia shows a single, continuous, region-wide layer of destruction that can be cleanly labelled the flood, that wipes out all antediluvian cities at once. Instead, we see many local and regional flood events, scattered across a wide span of time. Site A has a big flood layer around one date, Site B has a similar layer perhaps a century earlier, Site C seems to have weathered both without major damage. Famous candidates have been proposed. Early excavators at one city thought they had found the flood, a thick band of sterile clay lying between older and newer occupation levels. Later work showed that the same horizon did not appear at all nearby, and that the layer itself probably represented a major river flood, serious but local, not a world-ender. This is one of the core tensions in reading the ground beneath the myths. The archaeology is rich in floods, but not in a single flood. Part of the difficulty lies in dating. In principle, the method is simple. Stratigraphy, the order of layers, gives us before and after. Pottery styles and other artifacts let us align those layers with broader cultural phases. Radiocarbon, where organic material survives, can add absolute dates with a margin of error. In practice, it is messy. Different parts of the alluvial plain have different sedimentation rates. Flood layers may blend into normal overbank deposits. Organic material that could be dated is often scarce or contaminated. Some key sites were dug decades ago with methods that no longer meet modern standards, leaving us with partial records and ambiguous notes. Add to this the fact that excavation is uneven. A handful of cities have been explored in depth. Many others have only been tested with a few trenches. Vast stretches of countryside, the villages and small shrines that must have lived through the same events, remain barely touched. The result is a patchy regional mosaic, not a neat single picture. In one zone, we may see evidence for a cluster of floods and abandonments around a certain century. In another, the same period is quiet in the record, perhaps because the area was genuinely less affected, or simply because no one has yet dug deep enough in the right spot. In this context, the phrase "no evidence" needs to be handled with care. When we say there is no archaeological evidence for a single global flood in the 3rd millennium BCE, we are making a statement that is both strong and limited. Strong, because if a literal planet-wide flood had swept over all land, we would expect to see its signature not just in Mesopotamia, but in lake sediments, ice cores, coastal terraces, and cave deposits across the world. Those records have been studied extensively. They do not show such an event. Limited because no evidence in a specific ancient landscape can also mean we haven't looked in the right place yet, or the traces are too subtle for our current methods to resolve. Absence of proof is not proof of absence in a narrow geographical or stratigraphic sense. It is instead a reminder to be modest in our claims. So how do we responsibly line up clay tablets and flood layers without forcing them to match? One approach is corroboration rather than identification. If texts from a given region and era emphasize floods as divine punishment or cosmic reset, and archaeology from that same region and broad time frame shows repeated, serious inundations and rebuilding, we can say that the stories are rooted in a flood-shaped lived experience. We can note that the cultural memory of disruptive water fits the physical evidence of a risky river landscape. What we should not do is take a specific layer and declare, with confidence beyond the data, that this is Ziusudra's flood, or this is the moment when kingship passed from one antediluvian city to the first post-flood capital. Texts have their own logic. They compress, exaggerate, reorder. Soil has its own constraints. It preserves some things and erases others. The historian's task is to let each line of evidence speak in its own language, then see where their stories overlap in theme, not force them into a one-to-one map. When we do this, something interesting happens. The flood myths and the excavation reports start to echo each other, not in precise dates, but in patterns. Cycles of destruction and renewal, landscapes that demand engineering and ritual attention, communities that learn, forget, and relearn how to live with water. At that edge, where narrative memory meets sediment and brick, we begin to glimpse what before the flood might have meant, not as a single day when the world drowned, but as a long, unstable threshold that later scribes would seal with a single, powerful story. For the Sumerian scribes, before the flood is not just a date on a timeline. It is a different kind of time. When they open the king list with the words, "After kingship had descended from heaven," kingship was in Eridu. They are not giving you a neutral chronicle. They are locating the very beginning of political order in a sacred, unreachable past. Why do cultures do this? Push their origins back into a hazy antediluvian before. Part of the answer is legitimacy. If you say, "Our dynasty began when my grandfather overthrew the previous ruler," you have told a story that can be challenged. Someone else can claim that their grandfather had a better shot, but if you say, "Our institution began when heaven itself sent kingship down into the first city, back in the days before the flood," you have anchored your present in something no human can argue with. By placing the origin of kingship, agriculture, bricks, cities, even writing, in a time that no living person can remember and no rival can verify, you elevate them from human inventions to cosmic facts. Kings do not just happen to rule. They participate in a pattern laid down when the world was made. Meaning works the same way. Everyday time is messy. Wars, coups, bad harvests, successful reforms, charismatic figures who rise and fall. It is hard to see a stable pattern in the churn. A before the flood era lets a culture imagine a clean, legible world in which the basic structure is clear: heaven on top, earth below, kings in between, temples as the link. In that sense, antediluvian time is a mirror. When the king list talks about the first cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, it is sketching an ideal sequence. Each city holds kingship faithfully for a while, then passes it on. No usurpations, no civil wars, no foreign invasions. Just a smooth handoff of divine authority from one sacred centre to the next. Real history in southern Mesopotamia was nothing like this. City-states fought, borders shifted, kings boasted about crushing each other's armies and tearing down each other's walls. But before the flood, in the mythic imagination, kingship behaves the way it ought to behave: stable, orderly, clearly under heaven's supervision. The massive reign lengths, tens of thousands of years per king, do similar work. They are not meant as demographically plausible numbers. They signal qualitative difference. Rulers of that age are stretched across the centuries, becoming less like human beings and more like features of the landscape. They are embodiments of an era when the boundary between divine and human was thinner, when the gods still walked in gardens with kings, and decrees for civilization could be issued in a single, heaven-sent tablet. Then, abruptly, the flood arrives. Narratively, the flood is a reset button. It draws a ruler straight line between sacred beginnings and the more fragile, more flawed human history that follows. On one side of the line, impossibly long reigns, perfectly sequenced cities, a tight chain from heaven to earth. On the other side, more realistic reigns, dynastic upheavals, competing kingdoms, the kind of contingencies we recognize from the rest of ancient Near Eastern records. The flood does not just drown people. It drowns a mode of time. Afterward, kings can still claim to stand in the line of those ancient rulers, but they do so across a gulf. The antediluvian world becomes a charter myth. It explains why kingship exists at all and why it matters, without requiring that any current king live up to the impossible standards of the first ones. Over the centuries, later interpreters have read this structure in very different ways. For ancient Babylonians, the flood and the antediluvian kings remained part of a living literary and ritual landscape. Priests could recite lists of pre-flood sages, each paired with one of the first cities, as guardians of specialized knowledge, building techniques, ritual lore, magic. Later Jewish and Christian writers, encountering Mesopotamian stories in translated or adapted forms, wove them into their own chronologies, trying to synchronize biblical patriarchs with foreign king lists. Some saw the Mesopotamian materials as distorted memories of a single biblical flood. Others treated them as pagan fables that happened, conveniently, to echo sacred truth. In the modern era, fringe interpretations have often gone further. Some readers treat the antediluvian section of the king list as literal reportage, a straightforward record of real monarchs who reigned for 28,800 years each, ruling high-tech cities that vanished under a world-destroying deluge. Others argue that these texts preserve secret scientific data, coded astronomy, or messages from lost civilizations that operated at a level beyond anything we can imagine. The problem with such readings is not that they take the texts seriously, but that they flatten them. They collapse multiple layers, ritual, politics, theology, literary artistry, into a single question. Did this physically happen exactly like this or not? In doing so, they ignore how ancient writers used the past and how mythic time works. If we pay attention to the way the king list is structured and to its context alongside Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, and later flood retellings, a more nuanced picture comes into view. Before the flood is not pure invention, floating free of reality. It is built from elements that must have had roots in lived experience, real cities with deep antiquity, real shifts in political centres, real floods that erased older layers of settlement and forced communities to start over. Memories of older dynasties, perhaps already legendary in the 3rd millennium BCE, are folded into a schematic sequence and stretched to cosmic scale. At the same time, before the flood is not a simple historical record. It is a worked mythic space, carefully shaped to express ideas about divine order, just rule, and the fragility of human arrangements under the gaze of the gods. Holding both of these aspects together is where the difficulty, and the fascination lies. We do not have to choose between saying, this is all just a story and this is literally how it was. Myth, memory and history can overlap without collapsing into each other. A flood story can echo long patterns of inundation without mapping to a single sediment layer. A list of antediluvian kings can preserve faint recollections of archaic rulers while also serving as a theological manifesto. If we let the texts be what they are, literary artifacts of ancient minds trying to make sense of an unstable world, we can allow the mystery to remain. The before the flood of Sumerian tradition then becomes less a solved puzzle and more a shoreline, a place where the solid land of what we can document meets the shifting waters of what was once known, once feared, once sung about, and is now largely lost. So where does that leave us standing here at the edge of that shoreline? If we strip everything back to what the texts themselves actually say, the ground is surprisingly firm. The Sumerian king list tells us that, after kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It names a sequence of pre-flood cities. It assigns impossibly long reigns to a handful of antediluvian rulers. Then it says simply, the flood swept over, and starts again with more realistic dynasties. The Eridu Genesis gives us a world where gods establish cities and kingship, then grow dissatisfied with human behaviour and decide on a flood, only to relent for the sake of one warned survivor. Atrahasis develops this into a detailed negotiation. Humans multiply, become noisy, disturb the gods' rest, and the flood becomes one of several escalating attempts to manage an unruly population. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves an old man, Utnapishtim, telling of his secret rescue in a great boat and the birds he sends out over the waters. Taken together, these sources are very clear about certain things. They describe a divinely sanctioned kingship that begins in a small set of real cities. They insist on a dividing flood between a qualitatively different before and a more familiar after. They show gods arguing among themselves, changing their minds, and using disaster as a tool to reset or rebalance creation. And they remember a single human, or a small family, who survives by special knowledge, then becomes a hinge between worlds. Beyond that, the lines grow softer. When we move from what the texts say to what they might be doing, several careful possibilities come into focus. One is disaster memory. Southern Mesopotamia is a landscape shaped by water. Rivers wander, levees fail, whole settlement layers get buried under silt. It would be surprising if no stories of city-destroying floods circulated over the centuries. The literary flood may well be a distilled echo of many such events. Real inundations, real displacements, smoothed into the image of one overwhelming deluge that draws a line through time. Another is political theology. The king list, with its ordered sequence of cities and dynasties, is not a neutral encyclopedia. It is an argument about who should rule, from where, and under whose authority. By anchoring all legitimate kingship in a sacred antediluvian grant from heaven, it frames later claimants as heirs of a cosmic charter. Flood, in this view, is not just nature unleashed. It is a tool in the gods' hands to erase unsanctioned orders and reinscribe the right one. A third is boundary making in mythic time. Before the flood works as a conceptual fence. On one side are beings with thousand-year reigns, face-to-face access to the gods, and a clarity of order that normal history never achieves. On the other side is us, short-lived, improvising, constantly renegotiating our arrangements with each other and with the divine. The flood is the hinge that makes the difference intelligible. Archaeology brushes against these ideas but does not lock them into place. We can see cities like Eridu and Shurupak with deep, complex occupation layers. We can see flood deposits in different periods, some quite dramatic. We can reconstruct shifting centres of power and long-lived cult sites that might underlie the prestige of the antediluvian cities. What we cannot do is point to one layer, one date, and say with confidence, this is the flood, capital F, of all later tradition. There is no single, proven before-the-flood chronology hiding under the soil. No neat table that lines up mythical reigns with stratigraphic horizons. What we have instead is an intricate weave, texts layering theology over memory, memory over landscape, landscape over older, half-erased histories. For some, that lack of closure feels unsatisfying. For sleep, it can be strangely comforting. Because if we let go of the urge to solve the puzzle once and for all, the mystery itself can become a kind of quiet company. The Sumerian scribes are long gone, their reeds dried and crumbled. The cities they named have sunk, risen, shifted and eroded. But the questions they were asking are still with us. Where did our order come from? How fragile is it? What happens when the waters rise higher than we expected? How do we start again when everything familiar has been washed away? The antediluvian kings, the warning to build a boat, the line drawn by a flood you can never fully map. They become images we can visit, not answers we have to pin down. Like waves on a dark shoreline they arrive, shape the sand for a moment, and slip back into the larger sea of the unknown. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine those ancient tablets resting in the ground, some already unearthed, others still buried, all of them part of a long, quiet conversation between past and present. You do not have to solve them tonight. You can just listen and let the questions rise and fall like breath. If you'd like to wander through more of this deep time landscape with me, you can gently tap like, subscribe to the channel, and let these stories find you again when you're ready. And if you feel like sharing, you're welcome to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from as you rest at your own shoreline between waking and sleep.